I just want men to live their best lives, the fullness of all that God has for them. And I think that comes by us having conversations that challenge us to make change. Because ultimately, as men, we want to be challenged and we want to change. We just don't often know how. You're listening to Men of Faith, the podcast dedicated to calling men up and not out. Join me as we live a life dedicated to our God. All right, what's up, everybody? I want to welcome you to the Men of Faith podcast. This is the kickoff. My name is Caleb Cole. I'm your host, and I'm here with my season 1 co-host, the man, the myth, the legend, Brandon Miller. Everyone, make some noise.
Thank you for having me, Caleb. Excited to get this launched. Episode 0, origin story. Here we go.
I like the idea of the origin of this. Obviously, we're in a moment where I think that men need to be challenged in their faith. I know you and I have been growing constantly in our faith. And so this is cool to be able to do this with you and to, I believe, provide a resource, challenge, encouragement for men of all different ages, stages, backgrounds to join us in this journey of growing as men of faith. And so that's the name of this podcast, Men of Faith. And I'm excited to break down what that is exactly. What do you think, Brandon, when you think of a man of faith?
You know, I think in terms of us prioritizing faith and belief and trust in God as a way that we lead our lives and organize our resources and how we think about who we are, what we are. There's a lot of identities that we as men take on and things in our life that help shape who and what we see ourselves and how we want to be portrayed. And I think this podcast is, from our conversations, intended to give men a place to look as a priority, that first and foremost, we want to be known as men of God, or in our terms, men of faith.
Yeah, I think that there are some different definitions when you think of men of faith. And even our origin story, Brandon, you and I, obviously as men of faith, we are a part of a church together. I pastor a church in Old Sacramento. We actually have a campus in Old Sacramento as well as South Sacramento. And that's how I met Brandon. It's been, 4 years probably now that we've been running together in some ways, but more recently, I'd say the last few years more so. And, I love that anytime we've connected, Brandon, I've just felt so challenged in my faith journey. And I think this is significant that we get to do this together because you've been doing this journey a little longer than me. 7 kids, right? Married for how many years?
This will be 31.
31 years. So I have 3 kids, not even half what Brandon has. And I've been married for coming up on 17 years. And so I do think, within this podcast of talking about what it means to be a man of faith, there's so much that goes into that beyond just, I know the word of God and I worship Jesus. But man, being a man of faith is about all the dynamics of parenting, fatherhood, marriage, also just being a friend, being a part of a faith community, which we are together. And then going beyond that to, man, how am I managing my life, my finances, my health? There's so many aspects to what it means to be a man of faith that I think we often just focus on a small area. And I think that in this podcast, our goal is that we're going to touch on every topic. Nothing's off limits on the Man of Faith podcast. That's what I'm excited about with you, Brandon.
That's right. And I agree, because when we think about following Jesus and calling him Lord of our lives, and that he intends to permeate every part and piece of who we are, what we think, what we do, what we say. And I think it can be that we might try to compartmentalize our faith to the event of church or serving here or going there. And this idea that as people created to love God, be loved by God, and love others through that really is a daily challenge. It's a daily opportunity. And I love that we can explore and uncover different topics that are relative to men at whatever phase they are in life, so to speak.
Oh man, the compartmentalization of faith is, I believe, one of the greatest issues we see with men in the church today, where, we place God in the box of Sundays or an occasional men's event that we might attend. But outside of that, what part does God play in my life? Well, very little. And obviously, you and I have been on a journey. I've been on a journey of pastoring for over 20 years of trying to lead men that, hey, God needs to be at the forefront of every part of your life, that He is why we are doing everything with integrity and excellence, and not just putting Him in the box of a few minutes a week or an hour a week or hour and a half a week or however that
Or
looks.
before meals.
Or before meals. Yeah. Yeah. God bless this double bacon cheeseburger I'm
That's
about to
right.
eat to the nourishment of my body.
That's
But
right.
I think that what we want to do is really help men embrace this lifestyle of, man, I'm a man of faith in all parts: my job, my marriage, my friendships, my hobbies, my health. We just talked about my eating, everything is that God's a part of it, because everything ultimately we do is worship, right? I've always loved Romans 12, where it just talks about, like, let your life be a
Mm,
spiritual act of worship. Like, my
mm.
life is worship, every single part of it, not just the Sunday morning when I'm singing a song worship, but every single part, every day, every moment.
It's great that you mentioned that. When I really committed to being a follower of Jesus, and I grew up going to church, and some of our listeners will relate to that. But I don't think that I really made that decision that I'm going to follow Jesus until about 22. And when I made that call, the very first verse that I was encouraged to study and memorize was Romans 12:1 and 2.
Wow.
And offering our bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God, as our spiritual act
Hmm.
of worship. And thinking about that as, what would it look like if every day I was offering God my essence, my total, my all, as a sacrifice to Him in service and submission. And literally, don't anyone people on my passwords, but literally passwords for years were Romans 12 until I had to get more sophisticated. But it literally has lived as a primary verse. And it's one that, in my own journey, Caleb, it's one that God kept bringing me back to. So for maybe some of us out here that, we've had peaks and valleys, we'll call it, in our journey of faith, and times where
Yeah.
we were riding high and things were good and we were just feeling it. And then other times where it was, am I all alone out here? Did I miss a turn? And
Mhm.
that has been an anchor in a storm for me, that God has brought me back to that particular verse.
No, it's good. I think you talking about the ups and the downs, the mountaintops and the valleys of faith. I think a lot of guys can relate to that, that maybe they had that moment of, like, feeling excited about being a man of faith, about serving God. And some would say we've put it the terms of, like, oh, I'm on fire for God, on fire for Jesus. But then how quickly that wanes. And I think, my life or my story is one of actually more just steady consistency. And I think within that, there can be some aspects that are, I don't want to say boring, but it's like the discipline of consistently allowing God to be the center of your life, and to walk out a faith journey that, yeah, there are hard times and good times, but ultimately, like, I'm staying faithful, consistent. That's what's characterized my life. And sometimes I think that I don't realize how hard it was, that even though I stayed consistent, it was a fight for consistency. It was a fight for, and really it comes down to discipline. And I think that's one of the things that, like, we don't like to talk about
Yeah,
even in church, is discipline, because it has this negative connotation. And yet you and I both know, if anything is going to have long-term impact or effect, there has to be discipline. Like, steady discipline is what builds to the goals that we want to accomplish. And so I
that's
think
right.
that's something that that I want to see really a challenge for us as men, is that, man, that we implement disciplines, we stay committed to them. And
Yeah.
discipline is something that we don't like to hear, but we need to walk out.
Yeah, I'll add this to our origin because we basically, have a relationship forged in the fog of a pandemic, right? I think we met
Yes.
right before the pandemic when Project Church was still meeting in a theater in
Yep.
Midtown Sacramento, and come and visit y'all there. And at the time, I was looking for a spot that my teenagers would feel connected to, that they'd want to go. And I'll never forget having my, at the time, 17-year-old daughter go, "Dad, I really like it here." And it was, "That's it, babe. This is it. We're coming back." We
Yeah,
found a
yeah.
spot, and I think it was you and then your wife preached the next week, and hearing both of you just really sparked in the kids. But I can recall a couple of years later, and each year you would issue a challenge to men and anyone, I guess, who would join to read the Bible in 1 year. You mentioned that that was one of your disciplines. You
Yeah.
read the Bible in 1 year. And I remember the first time I heard it that I shook that one off hard. I was like that pitcher, like, quit throwing me a curveball. I don't want that. Like, stop, like, shh, stop that, Caleb.
Yeah.
You're making the Holy Spirit say stuff to me. What are you doing? But it rung, and it rung true that one of the disciplines in a season of my life where I had allowed a lot of other things to creep in was not consistent time in Scripture. And so a couple of years back, I took your challenge, and I didn't do. You invited me to go with you, and I'm like, no, I'm not ready for that heat. No, I'll start on my own with my sons. But I remember you and I having this conversation where I said, dude, like going through the Bible in a year literally saturated my soul. Like literally I felt change. I felt confrontation with the Lord. I felt encouragement. And the change that it brought was so transformative that I think that's some of how this conversation has spiraled into a podcast is there are just some super basic, important, practical things that if you're not doing it as a man of faith, you're going to feel it. But if you'll take them on piece by piece, could be transformative, change the whole game.
Oh my goodness. I mean, that resonates with me because it's something that I've done for years, but when I've invited men on the journey with me, I've seen, like you said, this transformation. And I do think, Brandon, that was what kind of spurred this podcast was you accepting that challenge. So I want to say props to you for saying yes to something that I know maybe isn't the easiest. And then what's crazy is it gets easier. I know now Brandon's actually, I'm a few days behind in my reading plan right now. But Brandon, we're actually on a reading plan together on the YouVersion Bible app. And Brandon, he's consistently writing what God is speaking to him on there. I'm not as good at that. I read it and then I don't comment, but you're on it. But man, watching now how many other guys are jumping in with us on that journey. And then I'm hearing more stories like yours of, man, I've never read the Bible at all, let alone in its entirety in a year. And just the challenge that has been, and yet the formation that takes place. And so I think we don't realize how much discipline forms us, and that's what's happening for a lot of guys right now. So I think that this is the Bible reading is one discipline of many that I think we are going to be talking about on this podcast that are going to help us all to grow, because that's really the goal of this, right? Like our goal of having this Men of Faith podcast isn't to hear ourselves talk. The goal of this Men of Faith podcast is to help men grow in their faith journey, because we know that when we're growing in our faith, everything gets better. Like our finances should get better, our health should get better, our marriage should get better, our roles, responsibilities, and how we operate in them at work should get better. I just want men to live their best lives, the fullness of all that God has for them. And I think that comes by us having conversations that challenge us to make change. Because ultimately, as men, we want to be challenged and we want to change. We just don't often know how.
Yeah, and I think as we led up to this, one of the realities that we talked about is that every one of us faces pressure, stress,
Mm.
frustrations, things that get in our way, just having, as you said, having a family, being married, having a job, extended family, finances, bills, difficulties. And it's so common to look to self first. I got this. I'll solve this because the way of man is I got to handle my own. And there's some truth to take ownership, take responsibility. But I think incumbent in what we're talking about as men of faith is we're continuing the conversation around why don't we try looking to God first? Why don't we get in the discipline and the
Mm,
practice of how we come to Him with this acknowledgement that if I cannot save myself, if I cannot change one way or the other of where I go after I leave this life, how can I change this thing or that thing or that thing? And, when Jesus says that you can't change one hair on your head, white or black, you can't, like, there's
yeah.
so little that you think you can do. And I think there's a liberating message in that, that it's a challenging message because some of us struggle with dependence. We struggle with the idea of needing someone else. And as a man of faith, we're saying, there are things God has imbued me to do. He's given me abilities and talents and strengths. And, I can be a person of consequence. And yet, if I'm not plugged in, to what end? Where does it take me? Where does it lead?
I think we just don't like looking at ourselves. There's nothing more uncomfortable than looking in a mirror and really looking closely and seeing where you're falling short and your flaws. So I think that often we just go through life and don't ever really look in the mirror. We just start going through the motions of what we've always done. And we know we're falling short in areas. And that's why marriage is actually good and hard, because our spouse makes us look at ourselves. And it's so uncomfortable because it's the first time that there's someone really going like, I know you. I really know you, but I'll actually call you out. And we don't want to call ourselves out because that's uncomfortable. We don't want to deal with the mess or the unhealth or the dysfunction or any of it. But that's the good and the challenge of marriage, is that there's someone that's like, I really know you and I'm actually going to call you out. But here's what I think is, as we build relationships with men, real
Mhm.
relationships, vulnerability, there's conversations like this where we're talking about the hard things. Maybe we can look in a mirror. And to be honest, I can receive it better from you, Brandon, often than I can from my own
Mhm.
wife. Like, I can receive it better from a brother than I can even from myself, looking at myself
Mhm.
in a mirror, because I don't really want to deal with it. But when a brother or two people are having a conversation and they're talking about something that I struggle with, I go, man, I need to figure that out. I need to start reading the Bible, every day. Maybe I could grow if I did that and made that commitment. Or I need to figure out how to be more connected emotionally to my spouse. There's so many things, so many topics, and we're going to touch on them. But I think that's what this is. This is an opportunity for us to help us look in the mirror and go, hey, we want to be better. Men of faith are growing. Men of faith are advancing, not retreating. Men of faith are carrying something
Mhm.
in authority. Like, that's what I want, is just men walking their authority. And I don't think we do anymore. We're passive.
Mhm.
We're even
Yeah.
submissive.
Yeah.
And it's like, man, I want to return that authority to men that we were meant to have, not in an unhealthy, toxic way, but in a healthy way.
When I look at a list of things we've talked about or recall, when we talk about identity and what does that mean,
Mm.
or emotional intelligence, we talked about disciplines, marriage, spiritual warfare, money, serving, purity, health. There's so many aspects that I think we're going to get to cover here in season one, that it gives us an anchor point for those of us that are going to listen and share this podcast with others, where our goal is to be candid. So, brothers, if you're listening today, our goal is to be candid and just to give you, parts of our journey, parts of other journeys, testimonies, scripture that we in turn hope are very practical and applicable immediately. Things that you could apply, take away from something like this, and perhaps even gather some steam around this, because what Caleb just described, those call up relationships with other brothers, some call them accountability partners, some people just mentoring, discipleship. There's a lot of ways it's described, but essentially it's a trusting bond between two brothers deciding, I can't do this alone. I'm going to need some others in my life to help keep me accountable and call me up to the next level. But we're running together. Sometimes you're going to be the one down, I got to pick up, or vice versa. Or sometimes we're going to need a third guy because we're both down, and all of that reality that I think men of faith can help produce in all of us that are on this journey of faith.
Yeah, you just touched on the call up. So that's something that we've been talking about, Brandon, and we want to end every podcast with is a call up, not a call out. I think there's a lot of calling out happening of men these days, and that's not our heart, that's not our goal. But what we want to do is call men up to a higher place, to a greater place, to be all that we believe God has intended for them to be and called them to be. And so I'm excited to call men up practically week in and week out on all the different areas and topics. And you and I know, like, we're not perfect in this. We're still figuring it out. We've done some things well. Obviously, you make it 30 years of marriage, you're doing some things well, right?
This
Remember,
year will be 31.
and I've done it for coming up on 17. We've done some things well, but we've also failed along the way. And I think that's what we want to do is like admit, hey, we're all broken figuring this thing out, but there's a higher place that we need to be called to, and that's what we want to do. Call men up.
And going back a little to our origin story, if you heard listeners, Caleb pastors a church in Sacramento, California, project church with 2 campuses. First church physically in old Sacramento, California, what, 100 years, Caleb?
In almost 100 years.
And then a second campus that was launched, I think, last year, right? Just in 23?
Yeah, 6 months in now. We're 6 months
Yeah,
in.
so 2 campuses and growing reach. For my part, I did serve as a pastor in my 20s. I did a lot of youth ministry, those who can relate, but subsequently in my 30s ended up shifting into an entrepreneur life, and so the last almost 20 years has been spent leading business efforts. So I come from a marketplace mindset in that regard, and so I think for our listeners, Caleb, they'll get a little bit of that flavor of where the ministry side comes from, someone serving actively, vocationally in the ministry, and someone actively out in the market. And I hope that adds some complexity and some depth to our conversations around calling men up and not out.
No, absolutely. I mean, Brandon's an incredible leader, marketplace leader, entrepreneur. I love your business mind. In fact, I just like to pick his brain. And so this is going to be a fun journey of us having conversations because we are coming from very different perspectives. And, you have adult grown children too. And so that gives you a unique
Even if
perspective.
your grandkids, for all you,
And yeah, you're a
shout out to
grandpa,
all you
bro.
grandpas out there. I'm amongst you now.
You're a young grandpa, so you look good. You make it look
Yeah,
good.
yeah. Well, I'm
Um,
letting the gray flow now, Caleb. I'm like, I've earned this gray. I'm letting it rock. So if you're seeing me on video, I'm owning every bit of it these days.
hey, you got it. Mine's coming in now too. But yeah, these conversations, I just believe are going to be unique and complex, and yet challenging for you and I as we challenge, the men and we call men up. Because I think biblical manhood is something that has gotten a bad rap. Even I don't know that there's always been clarity as to what does it look like to walk out biblical manhood in a healthy
Yeah,
way. And there's a lot of toxic masculinity out there right now. We throw out scriptures in the church of wives submitting, and we're not going to get into that today, but I think that ultimately, like, the authority and roles that God has given us, there's some confusion on how that
yeah,
operates or how that plays out. And I think that what we're going to do and our goal is to create a conversation that points men towards healthy leadership, healthy roles in marriage and in life, and then ultimately calling these men to greater places, greater heights, calling them up in all areas of their
yeah.
life. Because man, I wanna level up in all areas. I don't want to just level up in my spiritual life, but my physical life's a mess. I don't want to just level up in my marriage, but my job life, my work life is falling apart. Like, man, let's level up in every area. And that's what I'm excited to be a part of.
When you were just saying that about leveling up, growing, I think it's okay that we tell us all as we're listening is that if you find it hard to be a follower of Jesus in 2024, you find it hard to be a man of God and what we're going to call men of faith, and we're okay telling you
Yeah.
it is. It's the hardest thing you'll ever do. It's very difficult. And in fact, one might even say it's impossible without connecting to the Lord. It's impossible. And so, just to level set for all of us that this journey and these opportunities to connect in, listen to, find resources, we're just encouraged to be another brick in your wall and give you some insights and some encouragement. Maybe at times that call up, is compelling, and you hear it and you feel it. Like when Caleb was talking about reading the Bible, and I'm like, oh, I hear you, but I don't know that I want to hear you. Like that's probably going to happen to us along the way. And just know it's all good because
Yeah.
the conversation, as long as it keeps going, I find that my relationship with God, he just keeps the conversation going. And wherever I think I'm too far off, he starts it up again, one way or the other. And I'm even sure we're going to give time, Caleb, to just how to know when the signals from him, how to be aware when
Yeah.
those signals are coming, and time to respond.
Absolutely. I think that, within this process and journey of us building a conversation week in and week out, we just want you to be a part of this journey with us. To everyone listening, we're figuring this out with you, but we want to be a resource. We want to be a community. We want to connect with you. And so definitely want to ask, man, let's, if you want to be a part of this with us, be sharing this with other people, talking to the other men in your life. And then ultimately, like, man, be a part of this with us. We want you on this journey. And we're going to be building a community. I do believe through the Men of Faith podcast, we're going to be building a community of men with more and more to come where we're connecting, growing together, being called up together to greater heights, greater places, greater spaces. And I just can't wait to see what happens for each of us. I'm believing there's going to be stories after stories of men who like heard a conversation, listened to a podcast, and they were challenged to make some changes. And those small changes, small disciplines transformed one area, which then carried over to another area. That's what I've seen. It's almost like we stack
Mm.
the discipline stack, right? You do one, and then next thing you know, another one on top of that happens. And before you know it, there's a transformation that's taking place in multiple areas of our life. And then recognizing we're going to fall short. We're not going to be perfect. I still stumble and fall on this journey all the time of faith and pastoring and fatherhood and husband. That's the place I stumble probably the most. But character and integrity. I mean, man, it's not easy, like you said, borderline impossible in 2024. And yet, I do think there is a call up that God's bringing us to a different place, a higher place. And I'm excited to be a part of the journey with everyone.
I'll just mention this as well because, each Sunday at Project Church, I get to hear Caleb or any of the other leaders, make space for those who are seeking or on their journey of finding. And, I think it's important that you know that there's space here for you wherever you are in your search. If you have committed or you're far away or you're just sampling, you're still checking stuff out, you're not sure about all this, just you're welcome here. And we'd love to, have you join along and see where this journey takes you as we explore Men of Faith.
Thanks for listening to Men of Faith. If you got questions you'd like us to talk about on the show, we'd love to hear from you. Join the conversation by reaching out in the Facebook group, and we will definitely add it to our list. Also, if you want to engage with us at any of our quarterly men's events, you can check out projectchurch.com for more information. Until next time, grace and peace.